Welcome to the third session of the Daniel editions. This week we will take a couple of minutes to talk about the kinds of literature found in the Apocrypha. We will tell some more of the stories from the book of Daniel, including Daniel and the lion's den. We'll describe the visions from the last half of the book of Daniel and discuss some of the interpretations of those visions. And then we will read and discuss Susanna from the Apocrypha. But we begin with a word of prayer. O God, our Father, open our eyes and enlighten our minds as we study your word, so grant that our minds may know your truth and our hearts may feel your love, and then confirm and strengthen our wills that we may go out to live what we have learned. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So in the first two sessions, we told the story from the first three chapters of Daniel. Daniel and his three friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, were young Jewish men who had been taken captive by the Babylonians and were moved to exile in Babylon along with thousands of other Jews. Daniel impressed the king with his ability to interpret dreams and was given a high position within his kingdom. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah at one point refused to worship a golden statue erected by King Nebuchadnezzar and were thrown into a fiery furnace and left to die. We read the prayer of Azariah from the Apocrypha, in which Azariah prayed from the fiery furnace, praising God, admitting the sins of his community and accepting his fate while affirming his trust in the Lord. Collectively, the three friends also sang a hymn, the Song of the Three Jews, exhorting heavens, nature, and earth and its creatures, including all mankind, to sing praise and exalt the Lord. In the last three verses of chapter 3, King Nebuchadnezzar saw that the three young Jews had been protected by their God and were not harmed by the fire. He proclaimed that any blasphemy against their God would be punished. We will go on to tell the stories from chapter 4 in a couple of minutes, but first we turn back to the Apocrypha. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about the kinds of literature found in the Apocrypha. We said earlier, for example, that the book of Daniel as a whole is considered to be apocalyptic literature. The Daniel editions that we read in the first two sessions, the prayer of Azariah and the Song of the Three Jews, fit in the general category of psalms. They are liturgical in form. There is Psalm 151, which is also part of the Apocrypha. The prayer of Manasseh is considered a hymnic lament, which also fits with these others into a general grouping of devotional writings. The other two stories we're going to read in this study are considered historical fiction. Susanna and Bel and the Dragon are fictional writings set in the diaspora. The additions to Esther found in the Apocrypha fit the same category. Tobit is considered historical fiction or a historical novella set in the diaspora. The book of Judith is set in Judah rather than the diaspora during the same general time period and is also considered historical fiction. 3 Maccabees concerns the suffering of Jewish people in Egypt under the Ptolemies half a century before the rise of the Maccabees. This is also considered historical fiction. Some examples of Old Testament books sometimes considered historical fiction would be Esther and Ruth. There is one letter in the Apocrypha, the letter of Jeremiah. There are no other letters in the Old Testament, although several can be found in the New Testament. For example, the letters of Paul. 2 Estrades is considered to be apocalyptic literature, similar to the Old Testament book of Daniel. There are 4 books in the Apocrypha that fit in the general category of wisdom literature. The Wisdom of Solomon, the Wisdom of Jesus, son of Suresh, which is often called just Suresh or Ecclesiasticus, 4 Maccabees, and Baruch, although Baruch is a mixture of different kinds of literature. Similar wisdom literature found in the Old Testament might include the books of Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. There are 3 books that are considered histories. 1 Estrades, 1 Maccabees, and 2 Maccabees. The histories are similar in nature to the Old Testament books of Samuel or 1st and 2nd Kings. So you can see that there are a variety of kinds of literature found in the Apocrypha, similar to what is found in the Old Testament. Now we're going to briefly outline the story from the book of Daniel, beginning with chapter 4. Chapter 4 begins with King Nebuchadnezzar extolling the virtues of Daniel and his God and asking him to interpret another of his dreams. This dream was about a tree that was very tall and kept growing taller and taller and growing in size and strength until it reached the sky. Then a holy watcher came down from heaven and cut down the tree, but left its deepest root. There were 7 periods of time that must pass over in this dream. Daniel interpreted the tree to be the powerful king Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar would be driven away from all humans and live with animals for 7 periods of time until he acknowledges God. Then he would come back to power. 12 months later, the king's power was taken away from him. He was driven away and ate grass like the cattle. At the end of a period of time, his reason returned to him. He worshiped the God Most High and was immediately reinstated as king. The story in chapter 5 takes place after the death of Nebuchadnezzar, during the reign of his son Belshazzar. King Belshazzar, it seems, threw a party in which he used the gold and silver goblets taken from the temple in Jerusalem for drinking wine. In the midst of the party and the drinking, a hand appeared and wrote something on the wall. All the king's sages were unable to interpret the writing, so the king called on Daniel. Daniel told Belshazzar the story of his father Nebuchadnezzar, who was driven away from his kingdom and living with the wild animals until he acknowledged the one true God. Daniel explained that even though Belshazzar already knew all of this, he had still defiled the implements stolen from the temple, thereby offending the Lord. Daniel explained that the words on the wall meant that, number 1, God has numbered the days of your rule. It's over. Number 2, you've been weighed on the scales and you have been found that you don't measure up. Number 3, your kingship is to be divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. After hearing all of this, Belshazzar appointed Daniel as third in charge of the kingdom. Unfortunately for Belshazzar, that same night he was killed and his kingdom was handed over to Darius the Mede. In chapter 6, Darius the Mede appointed Daniel as one of 3 major officers to whom his administrators would report. Daniel did so well in this assignment that the other officers and chief administrators were jealous and plotted against him. They went to King Darius and advised the king to enact a law that stated that anyone who worshipped any god except Darius would be thrown into a pit of lions. Just like a good king, Darius followed the advice and enacted the law. Of course, being a good Jew, Daniel ignored the law, prayed to his own God anyway, and the other officers and chief administrators ratted on him to King Darius. The king didn't want to, but he was forced to abide by his own law and had Daniel hurled into the lion's pit. But with these words, "Your God, the one you serve so consistently, will save you." A stone was sealed over the entrance to the pit, and the king went home and fasted, unable to sleep all night. When he returned in the morning, he heard Daniel cry out to him, "My God has sent his messenger who shut the lions' mouths. They haven't touched me because I was judged innocent before my God." The king was thrilled. He had Daniel brought up out of the pit and had ordered the men who had accused Daniel thrown into the pit along with their wives and children. Darius then made a proclamation that all the people of this kingdom must revere Daniel's God because he is the living God who stands firm forever. And so Daniel was made prosperous during the rule of Darius and during the rule of Cyrus the Persian. There's an obvious similarity between this story and the story in chapter 3. In both, the all-powerful king demands his people worship something other than their Jewish God. The protagonists refuse, and as punishment, they're thrown into a pit in which they will surely die. But the Lord sends an angel or messenger who protects them. They are released by the king, who didn't really want to punish them to begin with. He praises their God as the most powerful God, makes a proclamation, and promises and promotes the protagonist into a high office. We'll see a similar story again in Bel and the Dragon. So these three stories are in the first half of the book of Daniel. The second half is made up of a series of visions. After the first verse of chapter 7, the balance of the book of Daniel is told in the first person by Daniel. Some of these may seem straightforward and others a little bit confusing. You have the consolation of knowing that you won't be the first person confused by these visions, nor will you be the last. In the first vision, we go back to a time when Belshazzar was still king. Daniel had a dream in which 4 beasts rose up. There was also an ancient one who took his seat on a throne. Then Daniel said, I suddenly saw one like a human being, coming with the heavenly clouds. He came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. Rule, glory, and kingship were given to him. All peoples and nations and languages will serve him. His rule is an everlasting one. It will never pass away. The interpretation of this dream was that the 4 beasts were the 4 kingdoms, but the holy ones of the Most High will ultimately receive the kingship forever. The 4th kingdom would devour and crush the earth. It would include 10 kings, but the 11th would say things against the Most High. But finally the kingship will be taken away and given to the holy ones. In another vision, and we're now in chapter 8, incidentally, at the beginning of chapter 8, the book switches back to Hebrew from Aramaic. In this new vision, Daniel is in the walled city of Susa by the Ulai Canal. He saw a 2-horned ram that represented the kings of Media and Persia, but the ram was defeated by a long-haired he-goat with 1 horn that represented Greece. But the 1 horn was replaced by 4 horns representing the 4 kingdoms. When these 4 kingdoms near their end, 1 king will step forward that is a master of deception. He will wreak unbelievable destruction, but finally he will be broken, though not by human hand. So Daniel's prayer in chapter 9 comes during the first year of Darius's rule. Now therefore, O our God, listen to the prayer of your servant and to his supplication, and for your own sake, Lord, let your face shine upon the desolated sanctuary. Incline your ear, O my God, and hear. Open your eyes and look at our desolation and the city that bears your name. We do not present our supplication before you on the ground of our righteousness, but on the ground of your great mercies. O Lord, hear. O Lord, forgive. O Lord, listen and act, and do not delay. For your own sake, O my God, because your city and your people bear your name. So then Gabriel came to Daniel and told him that 70 weeks are appointed for your people and for your holy city to complete your rebellion and to end sins and to rebuild Jerusalem. A future leader will come to destroy the city and sanctuary. His end will come in a flood. The vision of chapter 10 came in the 3rd year of King Cyrus of Persia. In this vision, Daniel was on the banks of the Tigris River when he saw a man clothed in linen with eyes like burning torches. The man told Daniel that he, Daniel, was greatly treasured. Another man who looked like a human touched Daniel's lips and gave him strength. The one like the human said he was going back to fight the leader of Persia, but when he left, he said the leader of Greece would come. No one stands strong with me against these leaders except your leader, Michael. Another vision, and we're now in chapter 11, came back in the 1st year of Darius the Mede's rule. In this vision, Daniel was told that Persia would have other great kings, but that a warrior king would come forward ruling over a vast empire. But his kingdom would be broken, divided into the 4 winds of heaven. He will not pass the kingdom on to his descendants. The southern king will gain power and will have a powerful daughter, but later the northern king will attack the southern kingdom. The war will last many years. The northern king would throw up a siege ramp and occupy a walled city. The northern king will hand out great destruction and occupy his entire kingdom by force. A worthless person will come and seize the kingdom by deceitful means. There would be another great battle against the southern kingdom. The new king will make the sanctuary fortress impure, stop the daily sacrifices, and set up a desolating monstrosity. At the end time, the southern king will attack him, but the northern king will storm back, take control of Egypt, but finally he will come to his end, and no one will be there to help him. At that point, and we're now in chapter 12, Michael, the great leader, will take charge, and every one of your people who is written in the scroll will be saved. But Daniel must keep these words secret. Daniel asked two figures standing on either side of the stream when these things would occur. He was told by the one set time, two set times, and a half a set time. But Daniel was to get going and keep the words secret. The wicked would not understand. There will be 1,290 days from the time the daily sacrifices stopped to the setting up of the desolating monstrosity. As for you, go on to the end. You will rest and will stand to receive your reward at the end of days. And that's how the book of Daniel ends. We talked a little bit about these visions and the division of the fourth kingdom in the second session, and we'll talk a little bit more in the fourth session. But in this study, we're probably not going to solve this riddle to everyone's satisfaction. So now we come to the story of Susanna from the Apocrypha. We can think of Susanna as chapter 13 of the book of Daniel, although modern translations often locate this story at the beginning of the book of Daniel. It could have been written as early as the Persian period, 539 to 333 BCE, but not adapted to the Greek version of Daniel until around 100 BCE. The original version may not even have been about Daniel, who could have been added when the story was added to the book of Daniel. And so we begin with Susanna, verses 1 through 4. The setting here is in peaceful Babylon, which the enemies are not the wicked pagan kings, but corrupt Jewish judges. There was a man living in Babylon whose name was Joachim. He married the daughter of Hilkiah, named Susanna, a very beautiful woman and one who feared the Lord. Her parents were righteous and had trained their daughter according to the law of Moses. Joachim was very rich and had a fine garden adjoining his house. The Jews used to come to him because he was the most honored of them all. The story is typically dated between 587 and 538. Basically, we know it's during the time of Daniel because Daniel is included in the story. Hilkiah was a common name for priests, so it's possible that Susanna's father was a priest. We go on with verses 5 and 6. That year, 2 elders from the people were appointed as judges. Concerning them, the Lord had said, "Wickedness comes forth from Babylon, from elders who were judges and who were supposed to govern the people. These men were frequently at Joachim's house, and all who had a case to be tried came to them there." So it says that year. We don't know what year that really was, so it was that year that we started this story. We go on 7 through 12. When the people left at noon, Susanna would go into her husband's garden to walk. Every day the 2 elders used to see her going in and walking about, and they began to lust for her. They suppressed their consciences and turned away their eyes from looking up to heaven, remembering their duty to administer justice. Both were overwhelmed with passion for her, and they did not tell each other of their distress, for they were ashamed to disclose their lustful desire to seduce her. Day after day they watched eagerly to see her. So they'd been distracted from looking up to heaven, that is to God, for guidance, but they had no difficulty looking at Susanna. We go on with 13 through 18. One day they said to each other, "Let us go home, for it is time for lunch." So they both left and parted from each other. But turning back, they met again, and when each pressed the other for the reason, they confessed their lust. Then together they arranged for a time when they could find her alone. Once, while they were watching for an opportune day, she went in as before with only 2 maids, and wished to bathe in the garden, for it was a hot day. No one was there except the 2 elders, who had hidden themselves and were watching her. She said to her maids, "Bring me olive oil and ointments, and shut the garden doors so that I can bathe." They did as she told them. They shut the doors of the garden and went out by the side doors to bring what they had been commanded. They did not see the elders because they were hiding. So, after being pressed or cross-examined, the 2 elders confessed their lust to each other, but we will see later that their honesty contrasts with what they say in court later on. We go on with 19 through 23. When the maids had gone out, the 2 elders got up and ran to her. They said, "Look, the garden doors are shut, and no one can see us. We are burning with desire for you. So give your consent and lie with us. If you refuse, we will testify against you that a young man was with you, and this was why you sent the maids away." Susanna groaned and said, "I am completely trapped. For if I do this, it will mean death for me. If I do not, I cannot escape your hands. I choose not to do it. I will fall into your hands rather than sin in the sight of the Lord." So Susanna's choice is adultery or death. Adultery was a capital crime. So if she is convicted of adultery, she will die. If she actually commits adultery, she will have committed a sin in the sight of the Lord. So not a good option. Then Susanna cried out with a loud voice, and the 2 elders shouted against her. And one of them ran and opened the garden doors. And when the people of the house heard the shouting in the garden, they rushed into the side door to see what had happened to her. And when the elders told the story, the servants felt very much ashamed, for nothing like this had ever been said about Susanna. The next day, when the people gathered at the house of her husband Joachim, the 2 elders came, full of their wicked plot to have Susanna put to death. In the presence of the people, they said, "Send for Susanna, daughter of Hilkiah, the wife of Joachim." So they sent for her, and she came with her parents, her children, and all her relatives. So in verse 24, we're told that Susanna cries out. Deuteronomic law states that a woman facing rape is to cry out in a loud voice. So that's what Susanna did. We're told that the servants were ashamed, which indicates dishonor that was brought upon the household. But we also notice that Susanna herself never displays any shame. We go on with 31 through 33. Now Susanna was a woman of great refinement and beautiful in appearance. As she was veiled, the scoundrels ordered her to be unveiled so that they might feast their eyes on her beauty. Those who were with her and all who saw her were weeping. So even though the trial takes place in her own home, the proceedings are public. We go on with 34 through 31. Then the 2 elders stood up before the people and laid their hands on her head. Through her tears she looked up toward the heaven, for her heart trusted in the Lord. The elders said, "While we were walking in the garden alone, this woman came in with 2 maids, shut the garden doors, and dismissed the maids. Then a young man who was hiding there came to her and lay with her. We were in the corner of the garden, and when we saw this wickedness, we ran to them. Although we saw them embracing, we could not hold the man because he was stronger than we, and he opened the doors and got away. We did, however, seize this woman and asked who the young man was, but she would not tell us these things we testify. Because they were elders of the people and judges, the assembly believed them and condemned her to death." In verse 34, it says that the elders placed their hands on her head. This indicates that they were serving as sworn witnesses. The original intent, of course, was to lay their hands on her body and rape her. They didn't get that far. We go on with verse 42 through 49. Then Susanna cried out with a loud voice and said, O eternal God, you know what is secret and are aware of all things before they come to be. You know that these men have given false evidence against me, and now I am to die, though I have done none of the wicked things that they have charged against me. So this is a prayer to God. She is not giving testimony. It was illegal under Jewish law to condemn her without cross-examining the witnesses or allowing Susanna's own testimony. The elders seem to have forgotten this part of the law. So we go on with 44. The Lord heard her cry. Just as she was being led off to execution, God stirred up the Holy Spirit of a young lad named Daniel, and he shouted with a loud voice, I want no part in shedding this woman's blood. All the people turned to him and asked, What is this you're saying? Taking his stand among them, he said, Are you such fools, O Israelites, as to condemn a daughter of Israel without examination and without learning the facts? Return to court, for these men have given false evidence against her. So God has responded to Susanna's prayer, not to the events that prompted it. The young lad Daniel appears. Here we have not an angel of the revelation of a dream, but the miracle that inspired intellect. We have Daniel, the young Daniel. We go on with 50 through 55. So all the people hurried back, and the rest of the elders said to him, Come sit among us and inform us, for God has given you the standing of an elder. Daniel said to them, Separate them far from each other, and I will examine them. When they were separated from each other, he summoned one of them and said to him, You old relic of wicked days, your sins have now come home, which you have committed in the past. Pronouncing unjust judgments, condemning the innocent and acquitting the guilty. Though the Lord said, You shall not put an innocent and righteous person to death, now then, if you really saw this woman, tell me this. Under what tree did you see them being intimate with each other? He answered, Under a mastic tree. And Daniel said, Very well, this lie has cost you your head, for the angel of God has received the sentence from God and will immediately cut you in two. The other elders seem to give Daniel wide latitude here, even though he is just a young lad and probably not a member of the bar. Daniel describes Susanna here as a daughter of Israel. In the next few verses, he will call her a daughter of Judah. He is also going to call one of the elders, you offspring of Canaan, which suggests sexual crimes that were historically attributed to the Canaanites. We go on with 56 through 59. Then putting him to one side, he ordered them to bring the other. And he said to him, You offspring of Canaan and not of Judah, beauty has beguiled you, and lust has perverted your heart. This is how you have been treating the daughters of Israel, and they were intimate with you through fear. But a daughter of Judah would not tolerate your wickedness. Now then tell me, under what tree did you catch them being intimate with each other? He answered, Under an evergreen oak. Daniel said to him, Very well, this lie has cost you also your head, for the angel of God is waiting with his sword to split you in two, so as to destroy you both. And we go on with 60 through 64. Then the whole assembly raised a great shout and blessed God, who saves those who hope in him. And they took action against the two elders, because out of their own mouths Daniel had convicted them of bearing false witness. They did to them as they had wickedly planned to do to their neighbor. Acting in accordance with the law of Moses, they put them to death. Thus innocent blood was spared that day. Hilkiah and his wife praised God for their daughter Susanna, and so did her husband Joachim and all her relatives, because she was found innocent of a shameful deed. And from that day onward, Daniel had a great reputation among the people. So we can see why some versions put this story at the beginning of the book of Daniel instead of after chapter 12. Daniel is portrayed as a young man here. In later versions toward the end of the book, during the time of Cyrus the Great of Persia, Daniel would have been at least in his 60s. The closing line, and from that day onward, Daniel had a great reputation among the people, sounds like the beginning of Daniel's adventures, not the end. Prayer and piety are major themes in this story. Susanna, a beautiful young woman, had followed all the Jewish laws, but was preyed upon by two unscrupulous judges. One lesson could be that following the law and prayer should be key elements of life of the Judeans in exile. It was Susanna's prayer to God that brought Daniel into the story, and Daniel was clever enough to get the two elders to convict themselves with their own false statements. This is not an obviously complex story. We can clearly see right and wrong here. But we can also dig beneath the surface to find questions for discussion. For example, we notice that though the story was about a virtuous woman, the hero who came to the rescue in the end was a young man who was not only quick on his feet, but understood both the law and how to convince the elders to listen to him. The elders who apparently would never have listened to a woman, no matter how virtuous she was reputed to be. Although set in the Babylonian diaspora, the Book of Susanna does not depict a lamenting community. The Jews possess wealth, autonomous governance, and even the power of capital punishment. They're comfortable, and most comfortable of all is the wife of the wealthy Joachim. His home is the locus of communal administration, and thus he is, by implication, the wealthiest and most socially prominent Jew in Babylon. But this economic situation is one less admired than critiqued, and the critique comes in the form of a woman. The reading of the character of Susanna is unequivocally positive. She is cast in the role of the righteous one, condemned to death because of her obedience to God. Descriptions of her social setting, however, are less positive. Some critics have offered theological lessons to perceive social inequities in societies where a woman's word isn't worth much. The story says God pays attention to the powerless, so the community should also. Susanna is also a projection of the threatened covenant community. Part of the diaspora whose borders have been shattered, she faces the temptation to lose self-integrity, self-respect, and self, to submit to be raped. To refuse will likely lead to a death sentence. Not only is she threatened, she is also threatening. No inexperienced child, she is a married woman with children of her own, and with a husband otherwise occupied by the affairs of state. Her potential for illicit sex is clear, and this potential, this threat, is underscored by her story's setting. Its intertextual references, it's forcing the reader into the voyeuristic role. In our next session, we will dig a little deeper into the visions from the book of Daniel and why they are a source of controversy. We will also read the last of the Daniel stories from the Apocrypha, Bel and the Dragon. Until then, keep your masks on, stay safe. See you Monday.